Okay, the first human body system that we're going to cover in this class is our integumentary system. And for all of the other body systems that we're going to look at, they're going to be having their own dedicated chapter. But as in most textbooks, our poor integument gets kind of the bum rap and is included in chapter 4 with all of the tissues. But still very, very important. So we're going to talk about the parts and the functions of the integumentary system. The word integument means outer covering. So that's going to include obviously our skin, but all of the other things that are embedded in the skin, hair, nails, and glands. The functions of the integumentary system. The primary function of our skin is to provide that physical barrier that keeps all of the parts in the body that we want to keep in and keeps external things from invading or damaging our internal structures. These could be things like bacteria or UV radiation. Skin also prevents our bodies from losing too much water, and so we don't get dehydrated, and helps us to regulate our internal body temperature. So we're maintaining that internal homeostasis. Temperature was one of those big examples. The cells of our skin, the plasma membrane that surrounds them, also contain a form of cholesterol that are converted to vitamin D when exposed to UV radiation. So that's one example of how our skin cells, or the cells of our integument, are specialized to be different from other tissue structures. And because vitamin D is only produced when exposed to UV radiation, it makes sense that those would only be found on the outside of our body, because those are the only cells that are going to be exposed to sunlight, exposed to that UV. Over the majority of our bodies, our skin is only about 5 millimeters thick in most places. So all of those functions are happening in a pretty narrow area compared to other organs that we'll talk about. However, because skin covers the entire surface of the body, it's actually the largest organ that we have. So we're going to talk about the 3 main layers of our integument, of our skin. The epidermis is responsible for that protective function. So that's our protective barrier. Epi means above the dermis, so or epi means above, so epidermis means above the dermis, or superficial to the dermis, you could think about it as. And then the dermal layer is a layer of connective tissue that acts as the place where all the other structures can be anchored, so blood vessels, nerves, glands, and hair. And then hypo means below. So hypodermis is below the dermis, or deeper than the dermis. And this is a layer of adipose connective tissue that's going to be connecting or anchoring our integument to the rest of the body. And hopefully we remember that adipose connective tissue is also high in fat storage. So this is where a big chunk of our fat storage is going to be found within the body, is on that lowest layer of the skin. We'll look at the epidermis in a little bit more detail. So just like the skin itself is composed in those 3 layers, the epidermis is composed of its own layers. So if you think back to our discussion about the types of tissue, what we're looking at here is stratified epithelial tissue, specifically mostly squamous. We're going to find squamous tissue here at the top, and then we're going to go to a little bit of cuboidal tissue towards the bottom. But stratified because it has more than one layer. And then the basement layer, we recall that all epithelial tissue has, is a layer of simple cuboidal epithelial cells. And then we'll go into our stratified active layers. And these cells are dividing rapidly from the basement layer, and as they get closer to the surface, the cytoskeletal elements of the cell, the microtubules, they're being filled up and replaced with a protein called keratin. And this process is called keratinization. And that's what makes this thin layer of tissue very, very strong to provide the protection from external things. So these are not simply squishy cells like we think of being not rigid like most animal cells. We are filling up our cytoskeletal elements with keratin, the same protein that our hair and our nails are made out of, to make them very hard and give it that extra layer of protection. Even though when we feel our skin, it still feels flexible, that keratin is doing a lot to keep those cells tightly bound together and to form that protective layer on the outside. The epidermis has no blood flowing to it, so there is no vascularization to bring nutrients to these cells. Nutrients can only reach cells through diffusion, these cells, these epithelial cells, which we remember is very slow. So without that blood supply, these cells are not getting the constant nutrition that they need. So eventually, they are going to die. But that is okay, because these are the epithelial cells that we are constantly shedding and replacing from that basement layer. There are specialized cells within the there we go. Specialized cells within the epithelial layer called melanocytes. And these cells produce melanin, which is what determines the color of our skin. So all people have roughly the same number of melanocytes, but the diversity of skin color among humans comes from the type of melanin that they produce and the size of the granules, the pigmented granules. So we can produce yellow to red melanin, or black to brown melanin. Just like nutrients move by diffusion through the cells of the epidermis, the molecules of melanin, those colored pigments, are moved to the outer surface, and that's why we are able to see them when we look at a person. The next layer down, deeper than the epidermis, is the dermis, or the dermal layer, and it's made up of mostly connective tissue. It's a much thicker layer than the epidermis, and this thicker layer provides all the substrate, the area that we need to hold blood vessels, hair, oil and sweat glands, and nerve endings in place. The dermis does not wear down or wear away like the epidermis, so it's much more fixed. The lower layers of the dermis contain dense connective tissue, which we've already seen contain many collagen fibers, which is what gives skin its ability to be stretchy. Unlike the epidermis, the dermis does contain blood vessels. So any nutrients that diffuse to the epidermis passes in the form of tissue from the dermal cells, fluid from the dermal cells. And this fluid is what you would see filling up a blister. So when you get a blister, that bubble forms in the epidermal layer, but all of that fluid is coming from the dermal layer, as well as any nutrients or anything like that. But here we're going to be housing our hair follicles, we're going to be housing our glands, sweat glands and oil glands, and nerve endings. So we do have pain sensation. If you were to be cut through the epidermis to the dermal layer, you would feel that, which we know. The hypodermis is the deepest layer of skin, and it's made of another kind of connective tissue, which we know as adipose tissue. And hopefully we remember that adipose tissue cells store a lot of fat. About half of the body's fat stores are in the hypodermis. So this provides that really thick protective layer to protect internal structures if the body is hit or we experience trauma. And this also regulates our body temperature. This is also the most vascular layer of the skin, so the most blood vessels. So if you cut all the way through the epidermis and the dermal layer to the hypodermis, that's when you're going to be experiencing more bleeding. Okay, hair is another part of the integumentary system. Humans have varying amounts of hair over the entire surface of our body, except of course the palms of our feet, palms of our hands, and the soles of our feet and our lips. Having more hair on top of our head protects our scalp from that UV radiation. I've had a sunburn on the top of my head, so I appreciate that. Hair in our ear and our nasal canals prevent particles from entering, so trying to protect our internal structures. And then eyelashes keep particles out of the eye, and together with the eyebrows, eliminate glare to improve our vision. And all of those hairs are anchored within the dermal layer of the integument. And then each of those hairs sticks out through the epidermis, and that part would be the shaft. Then that's connected to the root, which is anchored in the dermal layer. The hair follicle, where it's embedded, is surrounded by nerve endings, which gives it the ability to alert us to even very, very small movements. Then there's also, here's our first example of a muscle that we'll see, a small amount of muscle tissue housed within the dermal layer here associated with each individual hair follicle, and that muscle is called the erector pili. And when that muscle contracts, the follicle is pulled and the hair stands up. And that causes the little raise to our skin. So that's how we're going to get that sensation of having goosebumps. All that from that teeny tiny little muscle associated with each of those individual hairs. Nails, just like hair, are made of keratinized dead skin cells derived from the epithelial cells. So they make up the region called the nail bed. And they protect the distal or the end of our fingers, so the end furthest away from the joint. And while the cells that make up nails are dead and cannot sense anything, they are embedded in highly sensitive tissue and can sense even the slightest bit of pressure. So they will allow us to be able to better manipulate objects like untying a knot or removing a sticker. That could be an evolutionary advantage, but they kind of act like that sensory antennae. So we're able to protect the ends of our fingers from damage, but still be able to feel what's going on and then have complete dexterity and mobility of our digits. And glands are going to be the last group of things that are embedded and found within those layers of the skin. We have oil, sweat, and wax glands. Oil glands are found anywhere on the body that a person has hair. And they secrete oil to lubricate hair and skin, and then also inhibit the growth of bacteria. When an oil gland becomes clogged and the secretion builds up, that's what causes acne. So it's those either overactive oil glands or an oil gland that simply just has something over the top of it, and that oil can't get out, so it builds up. Sweat glands obviously produce sweat, and these help to regulate the body's temperature. So as we produce that sweat, which is basically water and a bunch of solutes, it's going to increase the evaporation of that water from our skin and cool our body down. Wax glands are modified sweat glands, and these are found only in the internal ear canal. So only place of our body where we're going to be producing wax, and that wax helps to trap small particles from entering the body. Okay, so those are all the parts of the integumentary system. I put a couple of questions up here. I'm not going to go through them with you here on the lecture, but they're just kind of to kind of orient your thinking about how you want to be thinking about some of these body systems. So we talked about all of the different layers of the skin. What types of tissue are found in each of those individual layers? We talked about those tissues individually, and now we're starting to see them work together. In which layer of the skin is ink placed to form a tattoo? So what we know about the regeneration of cells in the epidermis and the fixed nature of the cells in the dermis, hopefully that will help you answer that question. And then how does the production of sweat regulate the body's internal temperature? And I encourage you too, all of the answers to those questions can be found in chapter 4 of your book as well. That concludes chapter 4. So hopefully we have answered all of these questions. Again, if you have any additional questions or just want to talk about anything further, please reach out. I would love to hear from you.